There are too many parts about this game that would be too coincidental otherwise, and the enemies even grunt in pain as their various bodily fluids leave them in a shower of They just couldn't do only one thing really well. It is something that, when well done like it is here, I simply can never get enough of.
It has to be here. There's nowhere else on Earth it could be. Oh my god. Oh my god. This is it! At last! The legends are true! The fabled game known as Taifu, Wrath of the Tiger. Shit. Damn it.
You know, I was a kid once. Surprising, I know. I even had hope for the future at one point as well. Man, what was I thinking? But even after all these years since childhood's end, there are still questions from my youth that haunt me to this day. What was that brown stain on my wall? How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? Why did my parents like to jump up and down on the bed at 2 a.m.? What is love? But more than anything, the biggest question from my youth that still haunts me to this day is where, when, how, and why did I buy or otherwise obtain Taifu Wrath of the Tiger? I have a conspiracy theory that this game is just an elaborate hallucination I've been having for years because I've never seen or heard anyone else talk about it, or perhaps, much like me, it was conjured from the ether at someone's doorstep, because what other explanation is there for me not looking anything like my dad? Maybe this game is well known and has been talked about at length somewhere, but I haven't seen it, and because nobody has talked about this game at length from what I've seen, I want to address that issue because Taifu Wrath of the Tiger is a much better game than it gets credit for, which isn't saying much seeing as it gets no credit whatsoever, but what I'm saying is this game is too good to be overlooked this much. So nay, I say, this is day one of year one, and I'm going to give Taifu Wrath of the Tiger the shine it deserves, or would if I stopped rambling.
Now, normally this would be the part where I go into pre-release info and whatnot, but I'm gonna save that. You'll understand why when we get there. The only thing you need to know for now is that this game came out on February 28th, 1999 to fairly mixed reception. Holy shit. That was 20 years ago. 20 years ago today, in fact. Wow. I swear, this was not intentional. I was already planning on making this review. It just happened to fall right around the time that this game turned 20. Wow. That is very serendipitous. Well, anyways, with that said, let's take an extended look at something that was tragically overlooked, Taifu Wrath of the Tiger. Let's hop in. Too literal?
Of all the things to note about this game, the most significant thing about it in my case was that it has the distinction of being the first T-rated game I ever played. I owned The Legend of Dragoon before this, but I didn't play it for some time. I would backseat it with my siblings, but I didn't personally play it for many years. This, on the other hand, is the first T-rated game that I sat down and played myself. Actual in-game gore, coarse language, legitimate violence, mild adult themes. It was a novelty for me, and looking back at it now, it's funny to think how tame it is in comparison to the other games games I've played. Now, without the novelty, this game has to be good on its own merits, and I do believe that to be the case for the most part. There is, however, a bit of an elephant in the room when looking at this game, so I'm going to explain Taifu Wrath of the Tiger's premise because no doubt the 3 people watching this are chomping at the bit to hear it, but stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Even slightly. So this game centers around Tai, an anthropomorphic tiger residing in China. In fact, this entire game centers around anthropomorphic characters in ancient China, or at least a world of magic and wonder heavily inspired by ancient Chinese mythology and lore, with a heavy emphasis on the various types of martial arts, but in particular Kung Fu as implied by the title. There's a backstory you're not privy to, but it goes that several years before the events of this game, there was a large battle between the Dragon Clan and several other clans, which wiped out the Dragon Clan, the Tiger Clan, and the Mantis Clan, save for one survivor in each clan. You start off not knowing much, but the rundown is that the tyrannical ruler of the land, a dragon called the Dragon Master, and the last surviving dragon, has seeked out the Panda Sanctuary because he hears rumors of a tiger residing there, his reasons for seeking out tigers being unknown until later. You swiftly get your ass kicked, and as your sanctuary has been compromised as well as your food supply, you have to travel the land enlisting the help of the greatest warriors from each of the animal clans, including the monkeys, the swans, and the leopards, to learn their techniques, gain the skill necessary to overthrow the Dragon Master, and essentially become the hero of destiny while avenging certain people from your past. You also enlist the help of a wise sage, a mantis called Master, who's also the last surviving mantis, who trains you in the art of chi. Anything else would be spoilers, so I'll stop there. With that explanation out of the way, and even with the first 2 sentences of that explanation, many of you may think this sounds very familiar, and there's a very good reason for that, but for those of you in the cheap seats, let's recap. So it's a game based around martial arts, set in a pseudo-mythological world based on Chinese folklore. This game features anthropomorphic characters including a tiger, a mantis, pandas, monkeys, swans, and so on, and the game centers around our main character, a somewhat untrained warrior, on a journey to unlock the power necessary to defeat the most powerful being in all the land. Taifu Wrath of the Tiger? More like Kung Fu Wrath of the Panda. So yeah, this entire game feels like an early reinterpretation of Kung Fu Panda with all the humor taken out and with a gender-swapped tigress as the main character. What raises some more alarm bells is the developer of this game. Take a guess who made this game. Just take a guess. Anyone. DreamWorks Interactive. Yeah. So I'm going to sound like a bit of a conspirator here, but I have a hunch that this game was a direct inspiration, nay, the main or sole inspiration for Kung Fu Panda, which came out 8 years later. There are too many parts about this game that would be too coincidental otherwise. Sure, this game is vastly different tonally, but the initial premise is eerily similar. Just the fact that it's about animal characters, various martial arts, and Chinese mythology is enough to raise an eyebrow without all the other similarities. Like, what are the odds of having such a similar premise by the same company and not have it be connected in some way? That would be like saying The Force Awakens isn't inspired by A New Hope, or Greta Van Fleet isn't inspired by Led Zeppelin. It's just too much of a stretch. There's no fucking way. But, and I'm going to get a lot of shit for saying this, but just like Greta Van Fleet and just like The Force Awakens, inspirations and similarities do not diminish overall quality. For the most part, though like I said, Taifu is played incredibly straight, minus a few humorous moments, but nothing too jarring.
I'll say, how about that princess? Not so bad, eh?
Your fighting has decidedly improved.
I wasn't talking about the fighting.
Honestly, for what this game is, the writing isn't half bad, which, considering that this game was made by a studio that specializes in animated movies, you'd hope they'd at least have the basics of storytelling down, which they do, though they did also make Shrek the Third, so much for that. But more or less, each character is distinct, if sometimes a bit one-note, like the drunk monkey. A drunkie, if you will. All the masters are only there for a short amount of time, but they are generally likable. I especially felt sympathy for the Swan Master and her tribe, because they were forced to fight Tai as they were all prisoners of the Rat Pirate, and even in as short of a time as she was there, the Swan Master came across as such an authentically virtuistic character, and it also provides a valid explanation as for why people who are ostensibly your allies are fighting you. They do similar things with the other regions. Maybe they don't trust strangers encroaching on their land, maybe that region is controlled by the Dragon Master, and so on. An unnecessary but nonetheless appreciated detail, and the main villain, the Dragon Master himself, felt a bit like a mustache twirler, but his reasons for hating tigers does add a bit of much needed method to his madness. Plus, he's a dragon, and dragons are cool. Not enough stories have dragons. Even Kung Fu Panda. So there's something that Tai Fu has over that. I had the urge to take a look at the Chinese zodiac, and pretty much, yeah, it describes him almost to a T. He's an uncomplicated villain that you hate for uncomplicated reasons. He's a tyrannical ruler who stomps all over who he feels is inferior because he can, but he also secretly is afraid of ever facing a foe he can't defeat. He's very effective for what he is and does the job he needs to. Tai himself is also pretty good. He comes across as your run-of-the-mill, overconfident, quippy, yet selfless protagonist, and a bit of a dude bro horn dog, as showcased in the part where he meets the Princess of the Leopards.
She has quite the kung fu grip.
Put it on ice, hotshot.
As a matter of fact, I took a look at the Chinese zodiac for what it said about tigers, and pretty much, yeah, it describes Tai to a T, but that was probably the intention. As his backstory is revealed, you start to get a sense that he holds this great weight and responsibility on his shoulders that even he himself doesn't truly believe he's capable of fulfilling, or a great conflict that even he himself doesn't believe he's capable of overcoming. Standard, but nonetheless strong stuff. He's not perfect, but aside from Steve Harris, who the fuck is? When I say his backstory is revealed, there's a little something that involves Tai's origins, including his father, but even though it does give him a degree of character growth, the actual execution of the revelation is very half-baked and has no emotion to it because it was basically thrown in there out of nowhere towards the end. It's kind of brought up earlier in the game, but it wasn't such a big point that it was worth noting, so I didn't know it was really going anywhere. If it were built up better, it would have had more weight, so when it suddenly becomes a focal point to kick off the third act and the penultimate payoff before the final boss, they haven't really shown me how I should feel, so it's a bit jarring and forced. Just a bit. Another part that fell flat, this time for opposite reasons, was the Mantis Mentor character. He doesn't really do anything of note other than train Tai occasionally, and he has this air of mystery surrounding him, so I was 150% expecting him to betray you by the end, because he's a video game mentor, and their only rules are to either die, turn evil, or be Sully. But seriously, everything that happens with him was just screaming, "Betrayal!" And I was bracing myself for a twist that never came. I wouldn't be complaining about it if everything wasn't pointing in that direction, so I just end up feeling blue-balled when this character who exists basically with no purpose has zero payoff. But in spite of that, the narrative is basically solid. There's a big bad that's oppressing the land, go through several trials to gain the strength necessary to take him out. You'll find something out about yourself along the way and proceed to overthrow the baddie. Nothing you haven't seen before, but solid execution of standard hero's journey tropes deserves a golf clap nonetheless. It's a generally uncomplicated story with solid execution, and there are flaws. However, taking the good with the bad in these types of games is important. It's the only way to get the kind of enjoyment you'd want out of this kind of game, such as with the voice acting. One aspect that gives this game the edge over most games of the time is that it's coming from what was primarily an animation studio, so they had access to much better voice actors than were standard for video game projects, especially around the turn of the millennium.
Yeah, in this era you had this.
This is Snake. Colonel, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
And then you had this. That will never not be funny.
Which means that Tai Fu's voice acting is anomalously good for the time, though to my knowledge, the only character who sounds appropriate is the Mantis Master, which is funny because he's voiced by Korean-born voice actor Soon Taek Oh.
The monkeys and their treetop village is a sight to behold.
But then you have people like Tai himself. Oh, he's expressive, and for the most part has a ton of conviction to his delivery, but this is the voice they gave him.
Look what time spent caring for me has brought you in the temple.
Is that the voice you'd expect coming from a warrior born and raised in Chinese folklore? No, it's more like an inner-city construction manager in Detroit, or more accurately a robot in the year 3000, or perhaps a yellow dog. More on that in a minute. Speaking of dogs, I don't really have a dog in this diversity race because I have better things to be angry about. Like Ryan Reynolds. The bastard. I just find this whole thing worth noting, if slightly irrelevant to anybody who has a life. Diversity is a hot topic these days, and had this game been made today, I could almost guarantee the entire internet would be thrown through a tizzy over the lack of representation, but in this case I'm willing to bet that they probably went with American-sounding voices, because if every character talked with a heavy Chinese accent, you risk the possibility of these characters ending up with a comedy English accent, which would only make things worse. So I'm fine with them having cut their losses, and the voice acting is actually really solid for the most part, and that's all that matters to me. Each character conveys a good amount of verbal personality and conviction that really brings their personalities to life, even if 90% of the characters are there for less than a cup of tea. I especially like the drunkie voiced by John Cassier, who constantly slurs and stutters.
Shut up and let me introduce myself. And you are?
The Dragon Master voiced by Steve Susskind? Suskind has a very booming, menacing voice that I can't get enough of.
I was told a tiger had been raised amongst your pointless order of cowards.
And issues aside, I really enjoy Ty's performance for the most part. He has a very rich, full, if slightly dry delivery that carries an appealing, laid-back personality, but you can still buy it when shit gets serious or emotional. He's a really solidly voiced character, pretty much top to bottom, which should be the case because, as I implied earlier, Ty is voiced by none other than John DiMaggio of Futurama fame, one of my favorite voice actors ever. This was early 1999, so it was before he really found his definitive voice, but he's still really solid here. There's a sincerity to the voice acting as a whole that I very much appreciate, inconsistencies be damned, and even though the actual amount of voice acting is somewhat minimal, it's pretty well as good as it could have been. It's impressive how John DiMaggio has continued his streak of playing almost exclusively non-human characters for all these years. He's played robots, dogs, masks, gorillas, a penguin, another dog, and even a Scotsman.
Womp womp.
Yet it all started with his portrayal as a tiger. Yeah, unless IMDb is failing me, this was indeed his first in a long line of non-human portrayals, and if I'm not mistaken, his first leading role. How has a game with that kind of legacy been swept under the rug? Though part of me is actually glad this game is somewhat obscure considering our main character is a swole, shirtless anthro tiger. He's practically lewd bait. So if this game was more popular, I'd have to sift through significantly more aneurysm-inducing erotica. Don't call me prudish, I've just seen enough of that shit for one lifetime. For that matter, why do I keep coming across games that star non-human characters? I guess that's just a combination of kids' media having been filled with the buggers as I was growing up, as well as my parents being sheltering as all get out, so I wasn't allowed more mature games until I got older. Much older. In fact, I'm pretty sure I remember them being adamant about me not playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 because it had blood in it. Wow. We've come a long way. But if we're talking about character design, I actually quite like Ty's design. It's simple but pretty badass. You get a sense that he's a valiant warrior who could kick your ass without a second thought. He can just stand there and look menacing without doing anything. That's how badass he looks. Much like his personality, his design is simple but effective, at least in the game. On the title screen and on the game box, "You ain't got no neck, Lieutenant Dan." He just has a very, very long face. Bleh. I'd say Ty has the most memorable design in the game. There's no strictly speaking bad character design in this game. You have good and you have generic. Most enemy grunts are just standard enemies that look boring. Boring looking snakes, boring looking monkeys, boring looking stone mantis statues, and so on. Or things like these plant enemies that just look weird.
Looks like a vegan's final form.
Some of them stand out like these boar enemies. They look pretty sweet. I like the outfit design in particular. The snakes with the boxing gloves look unintentionally humorous, as well as the red snakes with the double-bladed swords. There are a few more standouts, but more or less, the standard enemies look generic. But I guess all that matters is that they all look the same under my fist. Giggity goo. All the named characters look generally good. They usually fall into the realm of anatomically correct animals wearing clothes, but they all have memorable, if simple, designs. The Leopard Master looks pretty cool. He looks like a seasoned warrior with a long beard and ceremonial robes. Or maybe they're his bathrobes. I don't know where I am. But his design is appealing and colorful. The Monkey Master is a bit of a design mess. He has what looks like a bathrobe, a curly beard, and a fez. You may say he's supposed to look like a mess because he's implied to be a drunk, to which I say, yeah. That's the point. I also quite like the Mantis Master's design. He looks like a seasoned monk with the stark red robes that contrast against his green skin, so he's very memorable. On the other side of the coin, the Dragon Master is almost bare-bones simple. He has a combination of pale yellow skin and deep blue that's very stark, and he has a beard as well. That's probably the weirdest part of his design that sticks out like a sore thumb, but he's a dragon, so he looks cool by default. The Rat Pirate in particular is another standout. He's like a giant repulsive rat in pirate's garb, or the Crusher Python, who looks like a disgusting reptilian mutant. Pretty much every boss has a cool, unique design. I'd say this game in its entirety has pretty good, memorable character design on average, in spite of the weaker aspects. I honestly think this game is a prime candidate for a remake because the only thing I feel is holding this game back, and in particular the character design back, are the graphics. Like, for example, Ty's tail is a flat texture as opposed to being a legitimate 3D model like the rest of his body, and it barely animates, and that's something that stuck out to me from the moment I started playing this game years and years ago, though I think it would be a bit too little too late for a remake, if only because people who have never heard of Typhoon, which is pretty much everybody in the entire world other than me, would immediately scoff at it for being a Kung Fu Panda ripoff. If only they knew. That's not to say this game is ugly. There are still a lot of aspects that I felt they wanted to make better but couldn't due to the hardware limitations, but for what it's worth, this game is still very pretty as far as the PS1 is concerned. It's probably as pretty as they could get away with. I will say that they tried to use a semi-fixed camera to disguise the environments popping in, which didn't work. You can clearly see the environments coming into existence before your very eyes, but that's understandable. They attempt to make it look like Fog of War, so it's pop-in that's not egregious given the context, but it's also the PS1, so I won't complain. Environmentally, I think this game is one of the better looking PS1 games. There's a crispness to the environments that you usually didn't get on the system. This being a game set in folkloric China, you run through a series of environments generally associated with that setting. You start out in the forest, you move to the temples, deep forest, ruins, docks, mountain ranges with ruins. It's all fairly standard stuff, and they're all lush, vibrant, and all those other buzzwords, with a bold use of vivid colors that looks very pretty. The forests in particular pop like crazy, with all the greens that contrast against the browns and the blacks. There's even impressive lighting effects that bring the environments to life. The mountain ranges are very bright, yet have a distinct coldness to them. The Mantis Cavern is another standout for how it's practically psychedelic, especially this weird waterfall thing.
Trippy.
Or the docks of the Swan Tribe, which also has really nice looking water and saturated contrasting colors. On the other side, you have places like these decrepit ruins. You can feel the desolation in the air as you make your way through these levels. They're just very barren, and you feel the emptiness of these sprawling environments. They're dull, but the dullness invokes a feeling of despair and bleakness akin to something like, I don't know, the scene from The Dark Knight Rises where Batman Homer Simpson's his back?
This is even more painful than it looks.
That feeling of failure. It's a tragic story told by the environment itself. Bleakness, which is hit home by the rather excellent rain effects. It feels lonely. It feels empty. It's great. Even when this game goes for a more dull color palette, it's justified properly. See also the clifftop levels, the dusty windswept badlands that look gorgeous for how desolate they are. These are areas that just looking at them you can tell have been conquered by an uncaring ruler. I especially like the water effects in some of these levels. It moves and flows in a very appealing way, if not realistic, at least compared to now. Looking at how this game looks here, this was probably the BioShock of early 1999, so this game pretty much looks great top to bottom for me. Even in spite of the 240p resolution cap, I can still find an appeal to these graphics. Proof, if proof be needed, that sometimes less is more. It took its limitations in mind and artfully crafted some very appealing environments that work with the lower resolution, a nice halfway point aside from the clear issues of things that were holding the game back. The only area I can say looks pretty meh are the levels in the Monkey Kingdom, because they're all fairly murky and bland looking, and the level design is pretty weak. It's just a series of narrow platforms where it's a bit too easy to fall off. More on that in a bit. The camera always seems to point in a single direction, that being towards the flat, bland skybox with a skewed perspective compared to where you are. It looks like if you're standing at 0 degrees, the backdrop is pointing at like 30 degrees. Honestly, these are probably the low light of the game visually, if not quite gameplay-wise, but we'll get to that later. That being said, it's worth noting the name of one of these levels. Monkey Treetops.
Why is it always treetops? Every single time there is a level in a video game with the word treetops in it, it always sucks liquefied eight. Oh, there I go.
And speaking of skyboxes, there's something that kind of bugs me about the aforementioned pop-in, as well as environments that end a little bit too quickly. Like, for example, during your exodus to the Leopard Lookout, there are sections where the camera is angled down, and you're at the edge of the environment, but the skybox is just a night sky, so it looks like the temple is just floating in space, like this is Crash Bash, or Ape Escape, or something. And the skyboxes in general are pretty weak for the most part, but otherwise, this game looks pretty damn good in the context of the time, and I personally find an appeal to the low-poly nature of the game, and that's something that's unique to me that many won't be able to look past, but all that matters is that you put a series of enemies in front of me to punch the hell out of and some blood effects to hit home the appealing violence that this game goes for, and that it has. Like, that's all you really need to know. You travel in what amounts to a perfectly straight line and punch everything that gets in your way until you win. You have a punch, a grapple, a special attack button, a block that somehow blocks everything in your path without fault, and a taunt for some reason.
Bring it on!
Bring it on.
And you're able to string some of these attacks together in certain ways, and that's pretty much it. There are aspects about this game that I was, and probably am still not privy to, because I either lost the manual for this game, or I never had it to begin with. Now, before I give my opinion on Taifu's gameplay, anybody remember the first Fighting Force game? I don't blame you if you don't, but it was also a 3D beat-em-up on the PS1. It was on other things as well, but it was most known for its PS1 version. I talked about the PS1 Fighting Force previously, the summary being that it was a mediocre 3D beat-em-up that had potential but was ultimately boring. While I actually had one person who claimed to be the world record holder for Fighting Force angrily contact me and tell me how wrong I am. Blah blah blah, you're wrong. Blah blah blah, you don't understand good beat-em-ups. Blah blah blah. You're the world record holder. Allegedly. Of course you'd like the game more than me. Well, I think a good counterpoint to me not understanding good beat-em-ups is why do I enjoy Tai-Fu Wrath of the Tiger? Because to be honest, they are very similar gameplay-wise, but Tai-Fu does the 3D beat-em-up thing so much better than Fighting Force. Fighting games are so simple that it's really just a matter of nuance that separates the good from the bad. They're games that are spent mashing the attack button for hours, and so mashing the attack button needs to be in some way enjoyable, and what is it that makes me enjoy Tai? Well, that's twofold. In one case, it's the sound effects. Audio is arguably the most important part of any beat-em-up, but it's usually the most overlooked. If it doesn't sound impactful to knock someone silly, then it's not going to feel good. It's like if you were watching a fight scene in a movie. How much of the enjoyment is from the Foley sound effects that they put in to increase the impact of the hits? Otherwise, you end up with that hilarious scene from DBZA where they're fighting Broly. Sound design is important, and man oh man, when they get down to brass tacks in Tai-Fu, you can practically hear the bones crumpling beneath your fist. It has the all-important visceral kick to it that has the same bone-crunching satisfaction that you would get by hitting a large slab of meat with a baseball bat. It sounds properly impactful, and I can't get enough of it. Even better, if you notice, while Tai himself is swinging his fists around, you can hear him loudly grunting in exertion. It adds so much weight to the combat when we feel as though the person fighting is himself putting in effort with every swing of his mighty fist, and the enemies even grunt in pain as their various bodily fluids leave them in a shower of viscosity while being bombarded by impressive and impactful visual effects to coincide and amplify the effects of beating the crap out of everyone in your wake.
Fucking hell, I need help.
I wish I could say more to that effect, but what more is there to say other than the sound design in Tai-Fu Wrath of the Tiger is superb. It has a bone-crunching viscera to it that makes you inadvertently wince with pretty much every hit, and then there's the combat itself, and when it starts, it's not great. You're basically only given one combo to start out, and very little is actually said about how you're supposed to play the game for optimal domination. You're just given a few basic instructions and sent on your way, which is fine, and the gameplay is still effective until you get to the first boss and are promptly pounded into mulch a few times before you have a pop-up that tells you how to beat him.
Seriously? Seriously.
Then he becomes fairly trivial, so that's a bit balls, but then you're given your first chi ability, and that's when you start to get a sense of what this game is really going for. It starts out on the borderline of bare bones, but as you progress, you gradually unlock more and more abilities and fighting styles that expand your arsenal of fighting moves, as well as opens up the level design through various secondary actions that come with said fighting styles. The Leopard Pounce, for example, gives you the ability to jump long distances, which gives the level design more opportunities to challenge you. The same goes for the Swan Glide and the Monkey Roll, though the latter was more situational, as the things that you can bounce off of, these lantern type things, just kind of exist. In just arbitrarily adding these, they changed the level design for the sake of the mechanic rather than organically expanding on the areas you can access and methods thereof, akin to the Glide or the Pounce. There's no reason the gap wouldn't be there before you had the ability to jump it, but the lanterns have no justifiable reasons for being there. Then they just appear once you have the ability that takes advantage of them, so it's level design that exists for the sake of a mechanic and not the other way around like it should be. But for what it's worth, that's excusable because the mechanic itself is well implemented and rolling around is hilarious. The combat starts out simple and gradually evolves gracefully, and the same goes for the level design, where it might start out simple with things like tar pits that kill you if you stay in them for too long, but otherwise you're traveling in a straight line. Then it ends up with complex, almost maze-like environments and environmental challenges by the end, with tons of unique challenges that take advantage of the mechanics you've learned. Early on, my favorite thing to do in combat was use the grapple, or as I like to call it, the oh fuck this. You can pick up people and throw them at your leisure, 5 feet in front of you, into tar pits, into spikes, off ledges. Before you've mastered blocking, this is your most readily available and effective offensive maneuver. It kinda defeats the purpose of the beat-em-up nature of the game, effectively saying, fuck you, you're not allowed to block this. Now hold still while I reenact the opening of The Lion King on your ass. Seriously though, it's never not hilarious to say, oh fuck this, and toss people around like Brock Lesnar off his meds, off of ledges for an instant kill. It's an unsophisticated type of fun, but I've never claimed to be a sophisticated person, and I'll preemptively say, take a shot every time you hear me say unsophisticated. but once I started getting more abilities, it faded into the background in favor of abilities that were more fun to use. At a moment-to-moment level, the combat is what you're here for, and it's fast-flowing and carries a significant amount of weight. The game's definitely monotonous, but there's such a gratifying weighty thunk to every hit. It really packs a punch, fittingly. The visual effects that go into each hit makes it all the more impactful. It's never not satisfying to see a flash of impact followed by a stream of pixelated blood. It's a simple yet effective pleasure. The standard controls are very simple, responsive, and smooth. It's not the most intuitive, as there are things that this game doesn't really properly explain and are kind of obtuse to figure out. The usual go-to combo is a standard strike 3 times followed by a situational chi attack, which fills up your chi gauge, allowing you to do special attacks, but the timing for the chi attack that fills your special gauge takes a bit of finesse, so standard button mashing won't do the trick. The combos have a digital input system, meaning you press the buttons and the combos will generally play out no matter how fast or slow you pressed them, as long as you pressed them at roughly the same speed as the animations themselves, so you have to think about how many strikes you've inputted before you do the final chi attack. It's also worth mentioning that the chi strike is invariably an AoE attack that clears out baddies like nobody's business. Your combos will depend on your stance. You can charge in for a deadly leopard pounce and end it with a flying ground pound, or a monkey bounce that also ends with a ground pound. They see me rollin', they dyin'. And the swan one, which I'll be honest, I never really mastered. In fact, I'll be honest, I never even figured out how to do it reliably. They're all fun to use and useful in their own ways. There's one more, but we'll get to that later. These abilities are obtained via the bosses. Things like the Leopard Princess and the Hog King are very pure, and so you get all the best aspects of the combat. Then there are things like the Monkey Master, which is just obnoxious, or the Rat King, which is half a good boss fight. It starts out very straightforward, then he activates his Kaioken, and then you have to fetch an explosive barrel while everything, and I mean everything, on the boat tries to stop you, so that's very obnoxious. The bosses are a mixed bag, but generally come out with a net positive. So that's the combat at a base level, moving in the forward direction and mindlessly clearing out fools by the truckload. Standard but effective beat-em-up stuff. Is there anything else you could ask for? There are these sections where you have to clear out X amount of enemies to progress, and these are where the gameplay is at its absolute purest, and there are only so many ways to say that it's fun to punch the things, but seriously, I can't stress enough how great the base combat is and how much of a satisfying punch it packs. It almost has like a primordial satisfaction to it that, while unsophisticated, is something that when well done like it is here, I simply can never get enough of. What can I say? I enjoy punching things. There's a reason why there's a 2-year-old bloodstain on my and fighting through to the end of a level by the skin of your teeth, it's an unmatched satisfaction, if only because the game's fun to play. The variety that's added to the combat via unlockable combos thoughtfully elevates the act of hitting things. It's an easy to learn, hard to master type of game. The skill floor is almost non-existent, as you can see in these early levels, but the difficulty gracefully arcs until you're pulling off 20 hit combos against swarms of enemies throwing the kitchen sink at you by the end of the game. With the camera being semi-fixed, it's easy to gauge where you are in 3D space in relation to your surroundings as well as in relation to your enemies, and the hitboxes are generous, and so you're rarely caught missing or caught on a different plane than your enemies without knowing. It's a one-note experience, but when you do that one thing really well, is there anything else you could ask for? In fact, I've played so many games recently that try and do too many things and fall flat on their faces through sheer lack of focus, so it's up to games like Taifu to not only specialize and do one thing really well, but also to gracefully integrate mechanics. It's actually quite elegant. The same move that you might use to pounce on top of an enemy and slam them with the force of an RV off a cliff can be used to jump vast chasms. That's something that I've often seen overlooked in many games. Just because your gameplay is one note, that doesn't mean you can't use that one note in a different way. This game even has a proper soundtrack for this type of thing. It's pretty badass. There's no one specific standout track, but they all pretty well carry the energy that you'd expect coming from a beat 'em up, and as I said, sound pretty badass. There's nothing more to say on that front. The Chi Blast is what you can use when you store up your Chi and release it for a deadly blast. You can get different scrolls to change up the power you use, but they're all functionally the same. They're an AoE attack that kills everyone in your path, but the unique animation is fun. People being sucked into tornadoes, turning to stone, going all Palpatine in this bitch with arc lightning, etc. They're a handy go-to, but are paradoxically so useful that I had a hard time using them in case I needed them later, but they're a good last resort weapon when you're in a tough pinch, and they're not so easy to come by that they lose lose their novelty. There are some other level-based gimmicks, like the level where you have to climb the mountain. There's a long gorge that will likely take several times and several lives to clear, followed by this area with an unreasonably strong current leading to a bottomless pit. They're generally inoffensive, but sometimes the level design gets a little bit more complex, and you have to find switches to activate rotating bridges. You might need to shoot orbs with your chi to unlock the way forward, etc. Whatever it is, it's little more complex than use key and door and requires no thought, so it doesn't really add anything worthwhile. The only challenge is figuring out how to use your projectile attack, the chi shot.
Now release by tapping toward your target and hitting triangle.
All I ever did was just point the analog stick forward and tap the triangle button until I fired the chi attack. This was occasionally useful in direct combat, but generally the AoE chi attack did the job just fine. Sure, it uses more chi, but the chi gauge fills up so fast when you get the standard combo down properly that it doesn't really matter, so the only time I really used the chi shot was when I needed to, like in these platforming sections. They just couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it, could they? They just couldn't do only one thing really well. They had to piss in the soup. The platforming is probably the weakest aspect of the game because the controls don't quite have the precision necessary for platforming much of the time. Once you learn the swan glide, the platforming becomes much easier, if only because it gives you more time to plan the landing, but until then, you're forced to jump around standardly. Sometimes on narrow platforms you'll invariably slide off, sometimes into something that propels you into a death trap like this strong water current, and sometimes just into a death trap. When you do have the swan glide though, they might have you glide across vast chasms in such a way that I wasn't sure I could go that way. It's just kind of obnoxious, and the platforming never became fun. Well, okay, it has its moments, particularly when the leopard pounce gets involved, but otherwise it's just a nuisance and it's way too easy to slip off platforms, which doesn't become a problem until later in the game. We'll come back to that. There's a minor collection element with these jade pieces giving you lives, but it's no more of a collection mechanic as the Wumpa Fruit. The only collectible that matters, 1-up and health pickups aside, are these power-ups that turn you invisible for a short period of time, so you can run around and throw unsuspecting people off of ledges while they scream in confusion.
I'm not a bad person, I swear.
The game does become easier in theory as long as you keep up with learning how to properly use your abilities, but this game doesn't get easier overall for two reasons. One, you're at the mercy of the level design, and two, you're also faced with tougher enemies as you go on, which is standard, but it also makes the combat more satisfying as it gets harder. That said, the other big reason for the higher difficulty in the later levels has less to do with the enemies learning how to block and attack better because that's manageable, and has more to do with the rather safe level design giving way to more narrow and winding roads. There is a minor puzzle element here with having to hit switches to unlock gates, so you have to go around these paths in the right order, but that's more obnoxious than anything, and even more obnoxious, Ty is a cat, so obviously he doesn't like water, meaning water in this game is instant death. Oh joy. Well, to be fair, so is falling into pits, but this is funnier. Lives in this game are generous if you're any good, so I can generally get to the late game with 25 to 30 lives, but the checkpoint system, while good enough in most cases, just isn't good enough by the late game. Most of the time, you'll be whittled down by tough enemies, and if not, you'll make one wrong move, fall into a pit, and have to do it all over again. The controls in this game are generally good for wandering and fighting, but definitely aren't good for precision movements. They're good enough, but it's only a matter of time before one false movement or lucky hit will have you fall to your instant death. The ending of this level in particular is an onslaught that killed me over a dozen times, to the point that I was afraid of getting my first game over, so I broke my own personal rule and I activated the invincibility cheat, but only for this one part, and I got through the rest of the game relatively unscathed on normal difficulty. The next portion of the game after this is where the combat really hits its apex and you really start to feel all of the abilities at your disposal, and after that, once you get the final power-up, forget about it. The game is over barring an hour of trekking. You see, on the way to the final boss, you take a detour to the mountains and you learn how to do the Tiger Strike. I both love and hate this. It's the most grossly overpowered move in the game, possibly ever, but on the other hand, it's the most grossly overpowered move in the game, possibly ever. It's essentially a one-move upgrade, but what an upgrade. All you need to do is hold L1 and press square for a Tiger Uppercut.
Hey, it's Capcom Santa. Oh, hey, I got a cease and desist.
It does one punch of damage for pretty well every frame that the game runs, so you can get 20 plus hit combos like it's nothing. It cuts through enemies like butter. Even the final boss, I made into my scaly little bitch in a handful of hits with this move. Even more, you end up in the air, putting you in the perfect position to chain the monkey bounce into it so you can get even more insane overpowered combos. The combo meter is pretty redundant for most of the game, as the combos have a predetermined amount of hits, but once you have the tiger uppercut, you'll get 20 plus hit combos like it's nothing, and you're unstoppable. With this in my disposal, I never died in direct combat ever again. The only time I died after this was in a level called the Shadow Gauntlet, which is quite frankly what every penultimate level should strive to be. It's a series of challenges that puts everything you've learned to the test and takes every ability you've learned on board. You have to master the monkey roll, you have to master the leopard pounce, and so on. If you don't master them, you will die and die and die, but it's just such a satisfying level to get through. Of course, with the aforementioned tiger uppercut, combat is trivial, but with all of these platforming challenges over lava pits, I died my fair share, but I was having fun, so it just motivated me to keep going. Nothing is more tense than walking that theoretical tightrope of using the monkey roll to jump from lantern to lantern suspended 50 feet above a pit of lava, and nothing is more gratifying than pulling it all off after a series of tries. It's long too. It's only a single area, but a basic run through should take 10 to 15 minutes. It's easily the highlight of the game, due in no small part to the camera behaving. The only time I caught a whiff of bullshit was near the end, where there are these arbitrarily placed lasers there which you don't even need to directly interact with, which is good because after I found out that they're an instant kill death trap, I steered clear from then on. Otherwise, from top to bottom, this is a fantastic level, and then it leads into the final boss with the Dragon Master, which is pretty weak all things considered. You can pretty much block all of his attacks, and then when you see an opening, tiger uppercut his head off, which can do something like a fifth of his overall health if you get him at the right time. So beating the Dragon Master is fairly trivial. It's interesting to note that Tai adopts multiple fighting styles, so by the end here, it's not Kung Fu, it's Tai Fu, his own interpretation and adoption of all these different martial arts that he used to beat the Dragon Master. Then a disappointing ending followed by a roll credits.
You put the FU back in Kung Fu. I don't get it.
I think Tai Fu Wrath of the Tiger is certainly an uncomplicated game, but it has all the same mindless and unsophisticated catharsis of squeezing a big ol' stress ball made of blood and pus. It provides a stimulating challenge while making the monotonous act of typing in button combinations to make a tiger hit things a satisfying action. The difficulty is meaty, the level design is mostly good save for a few levels towards the end. It's something that you can just sit down and enjoy, but it still provides a worthwhile experience that you can keep coming back to. It's a short game, only 3 to 4 hours if you're good, but it has enough crammed into it for me to appreciate, and it does pretty much everything it can with the core it had, and it stops just shy of where it would start becoming tedious, so it's pretty much the perfect length. It's not the greatest beat 'em up out there, but it does everything competently and ends up being a very fun, stimulating game. Aside from that, it has pretty visuals, impressive sound design, fun music, pretty much everything it takes to make an effective beat 'em up. Uncomplicated, unsophisticated, but fun nonetheless.
You know, I'm glad to finally be able to shed a light on this game. It's a game that by all rights should not be as unknown as it was. I mean, it wasn't some obscure Amiga game that was bought by only like 10 people. It was a mid-ranged PS1 game, a system that had an install base of over 100 million units by the end of its life cycle, published by a very respectable publisher. And yet, few people have ever heard of it, played it, or even seen it. So, maybe, just maybe, this will get the ball rolling for something like, I don't know, an HD remake, because this game very much does fit all of my criteria for an HD remake. But it is a very solid game, much better than it has any right to be, and is definitely worth your time. Oh, here we go.
A few moments later.
Congratulations, game. You finally fulfilled. Wait, why are you still here?
Wait, I'm confused. Shouldn't I be talking to the other guy?
The game fulfilled its purpose. You were supposed to let it go back from whence it came.
That didn't really answer my question.
Well, if you've grown so attached to this game, I suppose I'll let you go.
Heh? Still didn't answer my question.
This video was brought to you in part by my lovely patrons. I thank you for your continued support. If you want to become a patron for TGX, the link is in the description.